Well, even in the transfer portal era, Oregon football needs to keep recruiting high school quarterbacks. They don't have one in 2024, but they're after a couple. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day if you're watching on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe wherever you listen to or watch this show. Thank you to everybody who's done so already. We've got John Garcia Jr. in the house today because we're talking recruiting. A lot of names to go through. We got quarterbacks, we got geography, we've got offensive linemen to talk about. A lot of buzz on the offensive line recruiting front. We'll start with quarterbacks today. John, are you ready?
Born ready, baby. Let's get it.
Okay, let's start with Luke Moga. I talked about him on yesterday's show and was making it very clear that I was not making a direct comparison and saying he's the next Marcus Mariota. But I, for 10 minutes, sat there and watched his highlights, and I watched Mariota's, and I was just going back and forth. Just a few here, a few there. I think their throwing motions are kind of similar. Moga is a little bit smaller. I don't think he has quite the arm, but stylistically, they look very similar to me. What do you see?
I get it. I get where you're coming from here, Spencer. Let's not remember Marcus Mariota in high school as, Elite 11, number one QB in the country recruit. I mean, I know he did some things in college and was picked relatively early in the draft, but beyond that, there wasn't a ton of hype for him getting to Oregon. Much like with Moga, it's sort of an ascending opinion. But really the biggest difference is that Mariota was more polished at this stage because he was a quarterback for longer. Luke Moga is a guy who's moved around a little bit and has now been settling at the position. So I think the potential for him to improve in a very short amount of time is maybe higher for Moga than it is for most quarterbacks like Mariota coming out of high school. But yeah, stylistically, look, big, tall, strong arms, condensed motion, and pretty darn twitchy when you decide to tuck and run the thing. I think that's where you look at it from a Mariota doing so early in this modernization of the game and being one of the, I guess, faces of spread football and that modernization in college that we now see everywhere in the sport. And Moga is maybe a product of that modernization, to where you're like, hey, this skill set, if seasoned at the quarterback position, can become something that blossoms and takes something by storm. And I think that's what's happened with Moga and his recruitment. Over the last 12 months, he's a name that, has risen seemingly by the day. He runs 10.8 in the 100-meter dash at 215 pounds. There's not a whole lot of precedent for something like that for a kid who's, 6'2", 6'3" on his own anyway. And then you watch the tape and yeah, the motion is condensed. So it does come out rather quickly and he can push it down the field and outside the numbers. Now, within the intricacies there, I do think, you give Mariota the nod in very wide margins, but from a principle and a foundational standpoint, you can draw those comparisons. But even being in the conversation should be good enough for Oregon fans and basically anyone else at this point talking about quarterbacks, because I think if you look at the structure of the position and you want variance, you want guys who are ready now and you want guys who maybe are ready in a couple years. So I think you got to stack the roster that way. So any type of quarterback on this spectrum should draw similar excitement because it's not always about that 5-star day one starter, Dante Moore type, to bring up a familiar name here. So I think that's important to bring up as well, especially when there's a lot of unknowns beyond QB1, which is exactly the situation Oregon is in right now. So I'm a big fan of Luke Moga. He's an ascending talent who's going to have a huge senior season and outperform, I would guess, all of his numbers from his junior year, which was his first full year as the starting quarterback at his high school in Arizona. So the stock is way up here. And look, I mean, if you're, I guess, worried about it from an Oregon perspective, Kenny Dillingham at ASU is very much trying to keep him within state lines in Arizona now. So I think if you trust the ascent of Kenny Dillingham, you should probably trust the ascent potentially of a Luke Moga as well.
And Oregon's in a good place for Moga right now, is my understanding. Yeah.
100%, no doubt about it. This is really a three-team race. Arizona State, Oregon, probably at the forefront, and Miami was the sneaky pick. You know, he'd taken a couple of spring visits down to the U, but they got their quarterback recently in Judd Anderson, another big developmental project type of quarterback. So this is something that a lot of programs are not shying away from at this stage. I don't know if Moga wants to be the second quarterback taken by any program. So I think Miami and Oregon were doing the best job, and Oregon got the most recent visit after Miami took a quarterback. So the timeline here ahead of an April 28th verbal commitment certainly favors the Ducks. And I think Arizona State has probably moved to that number 2 position because of sort of the default nature of Miami's angle for Moga.
Let's talk about another quarterback in the 2024 cycle, and I do expect Oregon to have one in coming in from the high school ranks in that class. Just a matter of who and when and all the timelines, but that's what we do here on the show. So Michael Van Buren's another name that has been tied to Oregon before. What kind of player is he, John? And also, where does Oregon stand with him at this point in time, and what's his timeline?
Yeah, this timeline is another one that's accelerated, not as much as Moga's, but we do have a decision date. July 8th is when Van Buren is going to come off the board. So June official visits. I mean, that is really the ball game for him. Only one is set right now. It's to Penn State. So there's a reason why there's some buzz for the Nittany Lions in this regard. But he's a Baltimore kid, St. Francis Academy, huge national program. If you think IMG, this is a program in that direction, boarding school, recruiting from everywhere type of deal. So playing great competition there simultaneously. I think the only game they lost was actually to IMG Academy in 2022. And it's because Van Buren had a heck of a season. I mean, he's a truly developed and polished quarterback. He's kind of the opposite from a timeline standpoint than Moga is. I think he's a guy who's ready to go day one, but he doesn't project the same way. 5'11", 6 foot, a guy who, like Moga, is a great, and I mean great athlete, but I think as a passer is just a little bit more polished at getting through his progressions, playing efficient football as a thrower of it. So I think there's a reason why his recruitment has been a little bit more national than Moga's. He's been a name for a little bit longer, and he's at a huge, prestigious program. So Oregon's in the thick of it, hosted him multiple times over the course of the last year or so, including I think a couple days ago as we record this. So Oregon is making its run to be a contender here. If Moga surprises on the 28th and picks ASU or Miami or someone else, I think all the chips might be in on Van Buren. They might already be all in on Van Buren to try to lock in an official visit in the month of June to try to get one more trip out of him to allow that relationship with Dan Lanning and Stein to blossom just a little bit more. Because obviously, when you're talking about a tenured quarterback recruit that has been coveted for a few years, you're talking about from the Penn State angle being coveted by the same staff, even close to home, Maryland, Mike Loxley. That's been the battery there as he's ascended as a recruit. Not the same case with Oregon. So the visits matter even more under a relatively young coaching staff that has already made a change there at offensive coordinator. So every visit to Eugene is huge in the potential pursuit of a guy like Van Buren. So right now, that's the buzz. Penn State is the favorite because it's got the only official set. There is a sense that obviously Maryland, close to home, is going to be able to get him on campus one more time before a decision comes in. And Oregon's gotten 2 visits out of him recently. So those are really the 3 schools. Oklahoma was in there. Miami was in there, but each of them have taken quarterbacks as well. So usually that sort of writes you off for an elite arm like Van Buren's, whose skill set, again, if you're talking Mariota, he's the one in that conversation as well. Hey, truly dynamic, maybe the best dual threat available in the country at this point.
Well, I have something I want to ask you about those 2 quarterbacks and plenty more to get to on the recruiting front. But something exciting is coming to built.com on April 22nd. That'd be 2 days from now. I don't have all the details yet, but the excitement is real and it's something you don't want to miss. If you know how Built works, they have the most incredible protein bars in the world. They do these amazing flavor drops with unreal flavors in limited quantity. So mark your calendars, head to built.com on Saturday, April 22nd to be one of the first to discover what all the hype is about. I can't wait to see what the new flavor is. I'm a mint brownie guy through and through, but I love so many other ones. I had a churro puff the other day. It was fantastic. fantastic and kept me going on the golf course per usual. Make sure you use the promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off your order, LOCKEDON15, and make sure you visit built.com this Saturday, April 22nd, to hear about the new flavor. So the question I have here, John, is it looks like Oregon's in a good spot for Luke Moga. Let's say he commits to the Ducks. Is it out of the realm of possibility they go after 2 high school quarterbacks in the 2024 cycle? Like if Moga comes off the board and he's going to Oregon, is Van Buren just will they just cut off communication there and go with Moga as their guy?
I wouldn't. I think they're on totally different timelines, as we said earlier. I think Van Buren's a guy who, if you need him in 24, he could help you. I don't think Moga is in that category. So again, we're talking about staggering these quarterback rooms, not only from an eligibility standpoint, but from a readiness standpoint relative to your conference and really your offense and expectations. So I do think that it's not out of the realm of possibility, especially with the portal window, which is open right now. It'll be closed by the time Van Buren comes off the board, but not by the time Moga comes off the board. So depending on how Oregon wants to move forward with bulking up that quarterback room, I think that could be something that is a little bit more detracting to a Van Buren if Oregon hits the portal for a QB relative to a high school recruit in his same class jumping in the boat. And that's no disrespect to Luke Moga. That's whoever would have jumped on board for the Ducks. I think Van Buren, again, with his resume to this point, I think he's built to compete. You don't go to St. Francis to operate that offense if you're not in that mindset. So I do think that it doesn't remove Oregon from consideration. I just think at other schools, I mentioned Oklahoma in particular, I think their plan was to bring in one quarterback. So that effectively removes them. Miami is one we just talked about with Moga on the board, and they're in it for Van Buren, I guess, technically as well. They've talked about a 2 quarterback class. So this is the time of year where those possibilities are seemingly more open until the portal dust has settled next month. I think, all those possibilities have to be considered, especially when you're moving on from a longtime starter like Bo Nix will be come the end of this year. You've got to rebuild that entire room, and there's a lot of unknowns behind Nix. So volume and variance has to be a premium from a desire standpoint from Dan Lanning on down.
It's just like you say on the whiteboard there behind you. Happy portal season. It is indeed. I'm not a huge fan, just a quick note, of the moved up timeline. So it's happening in the middle of spring football.
Yeah, they changed that out of nowhere.
I don't get that. Go through spring football first, have your spring games, and then have you guys go elsewhere. Just calendar in college football. The calendar and scheduling, man. I don't know who's coming up with this stuff, but it's not people who understand the sport very well. Some of you understand very well how to get into the mailbag, which you can all do. YouTube comments, drop one on there. Twitter at Smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks are the handles. Mentions and DMs wide open. This one from Robin Bartram. It seems like there's been a lot more in-state prospects. Do you see this as maybe being a new trend in Oregon and the surrounding states? The last part of this question is kind of a difference maker to me, John, because I look at, the kids coming out of the state of Oregon, and it's held, at least in my view, I haven't, compiled the data because you'd have to go back a very, very long time and such. But it seems like the recruiting in Oregon is held pretty steady. You got like, I don't know, 3, maybe 4 4-star recruits coming out of the state at most in a given year. Like there's always been Tyson Coleman came out of Lake Oswego High School, is good. Dawson Jaramillo also came out of LO. I just shout out my alma mater there, of course. But you got your Trajan Williams and your Chase Cotas and Riley Williams. It seems like in the state of Oregon, it's in a pretty steady spot. Like there are a couple, but there's not going to be an overabundance of big-time talent. Thomas Tyner, also an in-state guy.
Yeah, great point. I mean, the numbers here are really what you have to go off of. And on that current Duck roster, there are 16 players listed with an Oregon background out of 100 players, so 16% of your roster there. So you're talking a handful of guys a year at most that would join the party from the home state. You think of a rival on a border state like Washington, it's more than double. They're closer to 40 players from the home state. So it's something that you approach that way. And you also have to consider who the coaches are, right? A young, ambitious coaching staff that has made inroads quite literally all over the country. When you think of following up the crystal ball era with that emphasis in the South, and now this current era of Dan Lanning carries over in that regard. Will Stein brings that Texas element that Oregon has been hitting well forever, seemingly as well. So I think all of that factors into this deal. So I think Oregon's always going to recruit nationally. It's a school that attracts attention regardless of coaching staff. That brand creates its own attention. I was talking to one five-star recruit. I won't name him, and to throw this staff under the bus. I was talking to a five-star recruit who's committed to a school. I'll give Oregon that. And they said, "Hey, was there a school that never offered you that you were like, man, I just wanted to kick the tires with them?" He said Oregon immediately, and this kid was very much not from the Pac-12 footprint, and he is east of the state of Texas. Those are the only hints that I will give. So that brand really does carry over, and this was on Saturday, by the way. So this brand does carry over independent of coaching staff and location. So I think all of those things push against the in-state narrative. So when the volume isn't there on top of it, it's going to be a footnote, even for a school that bears the state's name like the Ducks do. So it is increased, and I think other schools have recognized that too. You mentioned O'Reilly Williams. Other schools are going to come in and compete for recruits like that as well. So it does go both ways in that regard. But of course, when it does come to in-state recruits, if Oregon does push, they're going to win more than they lose, probably by a wide margin on top of that. So it is something to keep an eye on, especially if it continues moving forward. But yeah, it's a part of the conversation, but I think not the bulk of it at this point.
Yeah, the reason the part of the question that stood out most to me was Oregon and the surrounding states is what you alluded to with Washington. Like, it's a different level. Washington's got a lot more blue chip Power Five starting talent in that state. They just have more people up there, but it's also, I think, kind of a blossoming recruiting state in that sense. I feel like Washington is ahead of Utah, but I even feel like Utah is sending more and more. I mean, we of course had the Sewells come through, and they were both big time prospects and big time players in their careers for the Ducks. And I think, when you're talking in state, there are going to be a couple guys here and there, but I don't think it's at the volume that you can see in some of these other states. Arizona's been on the up and up for a long time. I think Washington's really growing. Utah is starting to get into that sort of space. But still, I say the same thing with in-state recruiting. Like, I want Oregon to get those guys because it's the sign of a healthy program for being the most desirable option for those in-state recruits. And it's one of the reasons, that we're all a little bit bummed that Keith Brown left, because he was, again, another 4-star guy. Like, there are several every year, but not as many as in other states. Like, if you go to California or Texas or Arizona or all these places, there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, and you won't even get to, 10 coming out of the state of Oregon. But I still like getting those guys, and I am bummed about Keith Brown. But there's a couple more guys to talk about. We got a bunch of recruiting talk today. Of course, that's what John is here for. And we want to go to the big fellas now. And I know you love the big boys up front. I do as well. I know a lot of people listening as well. A couple of fascinating recruitments. One in particular, we'll start with him, Fox Crader, a guy who is, in terms of his profile as a recruit, taken off like a rocket ship right now. He's a 2024 Oregon verbal commit, but as I look at the 2024 class, John, for the Ducks as it stands at this point in time, I feel like Fox Crader is the one I feel least secure about because of all the buzz he's generating right now.
Understandable, right? I mean, this is the type of kid that sees an ascent, particularly this time of year. So he always had the great frame and length, right? 6'6", and then it was just depending on where you looked. How much does this kid weigh? But then you watch the tape and you're kind of like, oh, it doesn't matter because he moves incredibly well and he plays bigger than he's listed at from a weight standpoint. Not something we often say about offensive linemen in particular, but you talk about modernizing that approach, and this is the type of tall, long, and lean player that has become the it window in the sport. These are the tackle types that you now go after, because putting on the weight with a Power 5 meal plan and strength and conditioning plan, not a big deal at any position, by the way, much less the guys who have the most frame and room to add to that frame. But I think the athleticism, the length, those are things that you cannot substitute. And Fox shows that in spades on tape as a junior. And then thus far in this offseason, he's up to stock even more as more folks have gotten eyeballs on him. So that early pledge and that early conviction from Oregon's coaching staff, shout out to Adrian Clem for that, is going to pay off here, because now you are the school everyone is chasing in this pursuit, even as more scholarship offers and eyeballs, push his way. That early verbal, I do think is going to be tough to overcome for other programs. That said, he's out in Washington. A lot of folks are going to go see him here pretty much right now. We're right on the cusp of the spring evaluation period where college coaches can officially hit the road. And there's a little bit more leeway with coaches hitting the road for the spring evaluation period as well. So there's no doubt that there are hurdles between now and signing day for Oregon with Crader.
Mm-hmm.
But having him on board so early, so convicted 5 months ago that he was going to ascend, I think is going to benefit the Ducks in this regard. And it makes it that much harder for someone to go in there and change his mind. But yeah, you watch this tape and you just like it more. The more you see, there's just more to pull from and like there with Crader.
You certainly rather have him be verbally committed to your school than be a school trying to get into the mix. But there's some big names that are going after him here. I've seen Oklahoma. I think LSU is in there. Like these are big time brands. Like how well do you feel with regards to Oregon's chances to keep him at this point in time with all this? And it felt like it happened so quickly. It was like a 48 to 72 hour window where all of a
Yeah.
sudden Fox Crader was like the hottest offensive line recruit, it seemed, in the country. So where is Oregon kind of fitting into this mix and stacking up against the other programs?
Yeah, he's listed at 290 now, by the way. So he is up. I mean, according to himself, he's 290 pounds. So yeah, a lot of those questions have gotten answered. And he visited Texas in early April, got that scholarship offer. And I think that was kind of the Kickstarter you mentioned. Oklahoma, TCU, fresh off of their national championship game appearance, and LSU have also jumped in there recently. I think April 15th, LSU jumped in. So yeah, it's about kind of the visits now. He went out to Texas. I'm not sure where he's going to be there going forward, if he's going to take in any more spring games. I think there's a bit of a worry there. And he's saying the right things for now. He's saying, hey, I'm committed, but I just have to do some due diligence, because to Oregon's credit, he had that green light before a lot of programs were willing to give him that green light. So how much does that matter just intrapersonally as a human being? Hey, you guys were willing to take a chance on me before school X, Y, and Z, but there's no doubt that his ascent is creating interest with other programs. And I think he put out a crazy visit schedule recently where Alabama was going to get him on campus. I think Stanford is maybe his last trip of this huge March and April swing. So you just wonder how much all of those will affect that pledge. But he's on the tail end of it. I think that's the last visit, Stanford. So he hadn't decommitted through visiting 6, 7, 8 non-Oregon schools over the last month. So I do think that is a good sign moving forward. But of course, as more offers come in, it makes you scratch your head just a little bit more and keep a closer eye on it. And I think that's probably going to be the case for the bulk of the cycle, because we're not even at official visit season yet. And if he's willing to take 7 or 8 unofficial visits to schools not named Oregon, imagine several official visits will follow that up. And now recruits can take as many as they want, because that is the newest rule in the NCAA. So it's not just about the month of June anymore or December, all in between now. I think you'll see recruits like this take a bunch of official visits. So you're going to have to keep recruiting him as if he was uncommitted from the Oregon perspective.
Well, one guy who's not currently committed is Brandon Baker, big time offensive line recruit out of Mater Dei High School, right in that Southern California footprint where Oregon has loved to go down and grab some kids over the last several years, and have done so mighty successfully, I might add. What's kind of the latest there? If Fox Crader ends up getting pulled away by one of these other big time schools, is Baker a realistic option for the Ducks at this point in time to try and go after?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, this is as national recruitment as it gets. And I think the only kid who's visited more schools than Fox Crader lately is Brandon Baker. So I do think it's a diluted pool of contenders for maybe the best offensive tackle in the class. But Oregon, much like with Crader, has been involved here among the earliest for Baker. I think Cristobal and company offered him when he was in 8th or 9th grade. So that resonates with recruits. He's frequented Eugene since the beginning of his recruitment in particular. So at a minimum, even with all these other trips under his belt, I think he was at Miami, Texas, Nebraska multiple times here lately. Even with all of these other trips under his belt, you think Oregon is going to be a true contender all the way through the cycle, meaning an official visit is going to be included in that pursuit despite that familiarity with Eugene. So if it all comes full circle, as it often does for truly national recruits like Baker, you feel good about the Ducks' chances. Of course, USC is in there. So many schools are in this race at this point, but I don't think the Ducks are going to take a step back to any of them at this stage of the game. And even if Crader sticks with the Ducks, I still think Baker is very much likely to consider Oregon all the way through his commitment ceremony, whenever that may come. At the earliest, it'll be preseason, but at the latest, it could stretch all the way till December.
John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting for Locked On, our insider here at the network. John, thank you so much as always.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.